Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about electioneering generally, and elections and the meaning of elections in the Western world, and particularly in regard to Australia's upcoming federal election, which is due sometime, I think, between March and May next year. So either the third or the fifth month is the sort of the pick at the moment of next year. And this is, of course, a federal election, and we've got states here in Australia, and state governments are elected separately. So, and at different times. Now, in the federal election, Australia's got a House of Representatives and a Senate, and there's like 149 seats in the House of Representatives, and I don't know how many, 75, I think it is in the Senate. Gee whiz, I've got to go back to civics class here. But it's approximately half the number that's in the lower house. So, and the Senate, of course, is a house of review. Now, both the main parties are pursuing policies, and all the major policies are exactly in line with the globalists. So mass migration, climate change, alternative energy, all the propaganda that's used by the globalists internationally is all used here and funded by Australian taxpayers and their tax dollars. So all the major parties, the two biggest parties, are the only ones that can really form government. They're both very pro-globalist. Now, one party is probably a little bit lukewarm on some of the things, but they still go along with it through fear of what will happen if they don't, or because they're nobodies who are just in Parliament to vote for globalist policies and just fill the numbers and just be stuffed shirts and so on. So, but nonetheless, both the major parties, when you look at the key globalist policies, there's no difference between them. And if there is a difference, it's so minuscule as to be barely worth talking about. Now, there was a prime minister some years ago in Australia who was clearly lukewarm about globalist policies, wasn't that keen on the mass migration, thought that the climate change propaganda was absolute nonsense, and didn't support the globalist initiatives that would create social division. So he was not necessarily just absolutely opposed to it and pushing back hard, but slow walking and very reluctantly doing the globalist things. So, but this gives you an idea of the power of the globalists. This is an elected prime minister. Okay, the globalists were able to get his colleagues to just chuck him out and say, "Hey, buddy, you're not prime minister anymore. The people may have elected you, but you're out of here, and we're going to put someone else in who's more palatable to the globalists." I mean, it's a stunning thing that an elected prime minister can just be kicked out like that. Now, when we look at the treatment of President Trump in the US and how the deep state and the globalist cabal effectively neutralised his presidency, or to a large extent at least, and whatever measures that Trump did take were rather timid, given the incredible array of forces against him in just about every organ of government and so on. So this sort of happens around the Western world. If there's a leader that the globalists don't like, they can pretty much neutralise them or get rid of them, as is the case with this prime minister in Australia. So really, no matter who you vote for, you're getting the globalist. Even the Green Party, that's probably gets between, say, 7 and 10% of the total vote in Australia. So they're never big enough to form government, and then they rarely win more than one, maybe two electoral districts at the outside. So their vote is sort of spread out, and it doesn't really result in them winning any electoral district or more than one or two, as I say, and they're typically the inner city gay lesbian type areas. So, but they support most of the globalist policies as well, such as the climate change agenda, the mass migration, gay lesbian rights, and all this sort of thing. The transgender bathrooms, they're all on board with that. So really the major parties sort of get sort of, for 40% each, then there's 10%, say 10, for example, 10% for the Greens. Then there's a few minor parties that come along and pick up the what's left of the vote. Now, there's certainly some movement in Australia where there's some new parties that are out there that are getting some impressive numbers with membership. I don't know how well they'll do. I'd imagine they've already been infiltrated by the security services, and as we speak, there's going to be a trembling little waif-like woman who'll say, "Oh, he raped me," and there'll no doubt be allegations of malfeasance and all sorts of things, and they'll try and bring them down or say there's been some impropriety of some sort. So I'd say that's probably already in the works now, assuming they appear to be making or represent any threat to the globalist interests. I'd say that's already in the works. But just looking at how we sort of came to this, how sovereign Western governments are just tamely surrendering to the globalists. I mean, whether it's Angela Merkel in Germany or Boris Johnson, who's filleting the globalists. He's such a keen globalist in England, or the Irish Prime Minister. Look at Emmanuel Macron, for goodness sakes. You'd have to go a long way to get a more enthusiastic globalist flunky than Macron. And the list just goes on. The guy in Holland and so on. So pretty much every Western government has rolled over to the globalists, and so this has neutralised, in effect, the voting process. The Western nations are no longer sovereign nations. The government and the politicians that the people supposedly elect are no longer in control of the country, of the nation. They no longer represent the people. They no longer represent the voters, and this is, of course, a big change from how it once was. Following the sort of World War I, the Depression, World War II, it was hard to find a politician that wasn't committed to the welfare of the people and trying to make their lives better and safer and cleaner and more prosperous and so on. But boy, has that turned around, has that gone. Now, the elites are looking after themselves. If you look at some, typically when there's a big shift in society and the power within a society, typically it comes about through some sort of revolution. It can be a sudden hit of say technological change. It can be a war or something major like the Great Depression, for example. It can be some sort of religious infusion, such as the beginning of Islam in the Middle East and the coming of the Prophet Muhammad and so on. So, but there usually has to be, or the Bolsheviks armed revolution. But there usually has to be something that brings it about, and mostly, and even if we look at, say, the overturning of the Shah in Iran and the religious revolution there with the Ayatollah Khomeini, it's typically a cleric class, like a religious class or an intellectual class, and students. Now, the Islamic faith is a way of life, so it's not just a case of going to church on a Sunday or something, but it's a way of life, and it very much has a moral and behavioural code built into it. And so when the students who've been to Islamic schools and that sort of thing, when they become agitators and they get out in the street and do things as we saw in Iran in the 1970s, then the clerical class and the students, the activist radicalised, if you like, students. They were the ones who were driving the revolution. If you look at, say, the French Revolution, where the clerical class were actually getting it in the neck, as they were exempt from many taxes, the mob didn't take kindly to them, and so some of them, quite a few of them, in fact, got a pretty rough treatment there. But the intellectual class, the likes of the Rousseaus and that sort of thing, de Tocqueville, that they were the ones that joined with the mob, not necessarily the students per se, but the mob, and what would have been the equivalent of students of the day, the angry youth and all that sort of stuff, to make that French Revolution happen. So in the West, we didn't have a clerical class, or not to the extent that we could launch a revolution necessarily, we didn't have a street mob in the same way as the French Revolution, but there was sort of a social media mob, although I don't know how many of the many hundreds or thousands, if not millions, I don't know how many of those are just electronic trolls. But nonetheless, there's students agitating in the universities. They've been taught that the West is terrible, all white people are bad, yada yada. But there's no intellectual class, there's no clerical class, and the intellectual class. Now, if we say, well, the college professors and the academics and the school teachers and the people that run the big banks, they're the intellectual class. Well, I don't agree. I don't see them as the intellectual class. I see them as rich elites that are determined to stuff money in their own pockets at the expense of everyone else. I think they're that. But in terms of intellectual elites, I don't see it. Now, if I think about, and I move in, some moneyed circles, if I think about the folks that I know who are extremely well-to-do, are they brighter than average? Sure, they are, and they're very self-assured about the amount of money they have. They'll never have to worry about money or anything like that. So they have a certain confidence that comes from people who never have to worry about tomorrow. But that confidence shouldn't be mistaken for people that know what the fuck they're doing. Okay, they're two different things, and in my view, there's no intellectuals. Certainly not that I meet. I'm sure there are some, but there's no intellectuals that I've seen in that class. So there's the rich moneyed class, and again, they've had a better education than average, and they've been to the Ivy League colleges and universities and so on. But in terms of people that even if we accept that they are intellectual, and I don't, but if we did, then they've got a sneering disdain for the masses. Now, the intellectuals of the Bolshevik Revolution and those sort of people, interested in power though they may have been, and the need to wield it to do what they wanted to do, they still wanted to make the life of the peasants better. They might kill people that would get in the way of that. But this elite class at the moment in the West, they don't give a shit about making life better. They are adamant that they need to take from the Western white middle class and working class to then not only stuff money in their own pockets, but give it to black, brown peasants that are being brought in from the third world. And the attitude is that the white working class are no better than the most intellectually challenged black, brown peasant from the third world. They're all the hoi polloi and they're all the shit on their shoes, and that's all they care. They're not interested in making lives better. So on that basis, the intellectual class is missing in action. Let's look at the universities. Now, the universities, they're the standard for what would make a professor has gone through the floor. I mean, you couldn't get any lower. Some of the people that I see being interviewed or that claim to be professors, seriously, I wouldn't get them to shine my shoes. I wouldn't get them to wipe my ass. I mean, they're that minimal. If they've got an IQ even of 100, I'd struggle to see. All they are is talking propaganda heads to sow social division on behalf of the globalists. That's all they are. They're the equivalent of Kim Fox in Lori Lightfoot in Chicago and in the government. Those sort of people being stuffed into government to create division, and in the universities and the colleges. So this revolution and I'm using the term revolution sort of broadly here, that's happened in the West. And it's a revolution in the sense that the people have lost their right to choose their government. And even if they choose their government, the government reports into the globalists and not the people. And that's a revolution in my view. And when we look at this as a revolution, where is the intellectual class? They're certainly not fighting back or pushing back against this. That they're nowhere to be seen. Or they just seem to have been missing in action completely. Maybe we don't have an intellectual class anymore. Maybe what passes for an intellectual class is someone like Kamala Harris or something like that. Maybe she's a leader of the intellectual class now. Or Joe Biden, what a juggernaut genius he is. So I can't see the intellectual class. My view is the intellectual class has been suppressed, and they're not welcoming universities anymore, because to be an intellectual requires independence of thought, and you can't be an intellectual without that. And the universities and the colleges and many workplaces, the public service, that's frowned upon unless you're 100% in globalist service. I don't think they'd accept someone who's independent, capable of independent thought. Maybe a real handful of the inner sanctum, perhaps, but not outside of that. So I don't think there's an intellectual class anymore. If they exist, they're certainly not in the universities or the high schools or anything like that. In fact, I don't know where they are. Where has the intellectual class gone? Maybe they're all in their kitchens doing videos on social media. but the intellectual class seems to have gone. So this revolution has just the taking away of our vote and right to vote and a sovereign government, which means we're no longer sovereign countries or sovereign peoples. That revolution has happened almost without us knowing or realising. There are people sounding alarm bells as to where things would go if current trajectories were maintained. But the reality is that the globalists have successfully taken over all the institutions and the governments and the politicians in the Western world. And they've done a good job of it, or an effective job. And so that revolution has gone pretty much unchallenged. Now, we need to find that intellectual class and build a nucleus around the people, the disenfranchised people. And make no mistake, we're disenfranchised in the West, and the intellectual class, and bring that together. And an intellectual would be someone who was a professor at a university. That doesn't apply anymore. An intellectual would be someone who had published works of some repute. That doesn't apply anymore, because the globalists have made sure that their flunky stooges are all published authors, supposedly genius authors, and that's bullshit. That they've just, the stuff's been ghostwritten. Look at Obama, he's supposed to be a fucking author. That's crap. So this is part of the how do we fight back? Now, maybe religion is going to be part of it. In the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Russia, communist Russia collapsed, in just the 2 to 3 years after the collapse of communism, and the churches more or less had been outlawed in the Soviet Union. Now, you technically could still go to church, but if you went, you were viewed as a subversive, a counter-revolutionary, a troublemaker, a problem, and once you're identified as that, you only had to spit on the sidewalk and you'd be off to the gulag. So, or they'd attack your family, take away their ration cards, those sorts of things. So really, other than maybe a few years over the 70 odd years of communism, religion pretty much disappeared from Russia, or certainly was strongly repressed. But within 2 to 3 years of the communist state collapsing, religion went from less than 1% of the population to over 30% of the population just in a couple of years. So that goes to show that when the opportunity is there can be a resurgence of, in this case, faith-based activity, but other activity. So we shouldn't look at the situation as hopeless. And if you look at the desperate measures that the in the United States that they're getting the Justice Department's justice. What a name for that! It's not even Justice's asshole at the moment. When you look at the behaviour of the Attorney General's Department and the FBI, that sort of thing. When you look at their behaviour in going after blatantly going after political opponents, then you've got to sort of say, well, why are they being that desperate? Why are they overreaching to that extent? That's crazy. And it goes to show, do you want those sort of guys running the country doing what they're doing? I don't think so. And so they're not confident. They're not confident of their power and their position and their ability to exercise power. So they've gone to that next step, just crush anyone you don't like. And that's power run amok, and it's a good sign perhaps for the future. When I say a good sign, as in maybe they see their little crazy dream disintegrating, the globalist dream. I don't know what their perception is, but again, if they were confident, they wouldn't be doing this stuff. So that's my take on things. I look forward to your comments below. You've been with Tassus today, and thank you for listening.